upon the state's motion to dismiss the case.
People found not guilty after serving a life sentence. Number 1. Kwame Ajamu. Kwame Ajamu, formerly known as Ronnie Bridgman, was pinned down for a crime he didn't commit based entirely on wrong evidence given from Eddie Vernon, who, at the time, was a mere 12 years old. Kwame's brother Wiley and friend Ricky Jackson also got wrapped up in the accusation, as they were all convicted of a murder-robbery in Cleveland, Ohio, of money order salesman Harold Franks. The most astonishing detail about the initial conviction was that all 3 men were sentenced to death with no forensic evidence, no previous criminal convictions, and numerous witnesses offering an alibi for all of them. Vernon, the boy who gave the only testimony against the 3, recanted his story years later following a meeting with his pastor. He said he'd been put under extreme amounts of pressure to testify against the 3 innocent men. As a result of Vernon's bravery in stepping forward following what must have been a huge weight of guilt he carried around for all those years, Kwame, or Ronnie as he was known back then, and Wiley Bridgman were finally paroled in 2003 and 2004. Ricky Jackson was not so lucky and had to wait another 10 years before stepping outside after an almost 40-year term in prison. $18 million was paid in compensation to the 3 men, but you wonder why it took so long for their freedom to be realized, or how it even happened in the first place. Kwame Ajamu changed his name in fear of the stigma around his false arrest, which shows there's no price that can be put on freedom. The guilty parties in this case were the authorities who pressured a young, vulnerable Vernon, and those authorities should have to deal with severe consequences, as per the original sentencing in which they, quite literally, nearly killed 3 innocent men.
Is that I couldn't cry. I couldn't even grieve for my mother because they had made me so callous.
Number 2. Richard Phillips. A 46-year stint was served up for Richard Phillips, following one of the most lazy attempts at justice the system has ever seen. Phillips is known as the longest-serving exoneree in America's history and was convicted of a murder he didn't commit while already locked up for an armed robbery. It was the betrayal of a former friend, Fred Mitchell, that led to his conviction. Someone he'd been knocking around with in his younger days, but fell back in with and ended up on the wrong side of a poor decision. Richard Palumbo and Phillips were said to have been involved in a robbery a year prior, even though Mitchell was alleged to have been in the lineup. Then, when the body of murdered Gregory Harris showed up, Fred Mitchell testified against Palumbo and threw Phillips into the mix to protect himself. Phillips claimed that Mitchell had already killed Gregory Harris for revenge because Harris had previously stolen from his mother. High on self-interest, Fred Mitchell lied in court to preserve his own freedom, but locked up another innocent man in Phillips. Palumbo is currently serving a life sentence, while Phillips turned to painting and drawing to keep himself busy on the longest shift of his life. The hardest thing he had to do in prison was miss his mother's funeral when she passed away back in 2005, a moment which has left its mark on Phillips, as all he claimed he wanted to do inside was, as he put it, survive and not be put in the position where I would have to kill or assault someone else to get more time. Eventually, a series of events triggered Richard Phillips's release. Palumbo went before a hearing and told the authorities that Phillips was never involved in the murder. The University of Michigan Innocence Clinic began working towards his release in 2004. And finally, in 2017, a judge overturned his conviction. He was finally freed, an old 71 years of age, but a very proud and happy man. Number 3. Bobby Johnson. An interrogation of a 16-year-old without his parents left Bobby Johnson another victim of miscarried justice, as Johnson was convicted of the murder of 70-year-old Herbert Fields, who was shot dead after suspected robbery. 9 years on, at 25 years of age, Bobby walked out a free man following the vacation of his conviction by a judge at New Haven Superior Court. The Connecticut Innocence Project were heavily involved as they seek justice for a man who was lied to about physical evidence tying him to the crime. Another case of coercive police officers as they pressured Johnson into confessing to something that he was never a part of. Johnson pleaded guilty to murder, but was broken by the worst kind of corruption. Number 4, Steven Avery.
We were getting ready to bring a lawsuit.
It's $36 million. Manitowoc County itself and the sheriff and the DA would be on the hook for those damages.
They're not handing that kind of money over to Steve Avery. I did tell him, be careful. They're not even close to being finished with you.
We've all seen the Netflix documentary, and if you haven't, then you definitely should. Making a Murderer was the most talked about television show during the early winter of 2016, as it was released to a massive positive critical reception with plenty of conspiracy theories along the way. The show covered the period of time during Steven Avery's conviction, release, and subsequent second charge of the violent murder of Teresa Halbach. In summary, Steven Avery first served 18 years for a wrongful conviction of a brutal attack and sexual assault in 1985 in Lake Michigan. He was eventually exonerated after DNA testing, which wasn't available at his first hearing, later helped prove that someone else had committed the crime. Avery was then released in 2003, and a civil lawsuit was filed for $36 million in damages to be paid, suing Manitowoc County, the sheriff, and its former district attorney who locked him up. Then, a sudden twist of fate landed Avery back in the courtroom after evidence mounted of a murder he said he did not commit. The primary thread of the story that ensued was a fantastical and bizarre script that was already written for directors Laura Riccardi and Moira Demos, who found themselves chronicling one of the most fascinating cases in America's history. Although found innocent for his first alleged crime, Steven Avery was found guilty of first-degree murder for the second time in 2007. The documentary has led many to suspect that foul play or police corruption were the catalyst for his arrest due to the nature of his high-profile lawsuit claim against Manitowoc County. But again, these are just theories that can't be proven, just mulled over like a fine wine or the TV series itself.
Tonight, Steven Avery has been moved from a maximum security prison to a medium security facility. He was transferred Tuesday from Waupun to Fox Lake in Dodge County. Avery is serving a life sentence for killing Teresa Halbach in 2005. That case gained international attention when the Netflix documentary series came out, Making a Murderer.
Number 5, James Joseph Richardson. One of the worst crimes you can be accused of is a murder of your own family member. Well, James Joseph Richardson was not only accused of killing one, but all 7 of his children. Packed lunches were made for the children, and following the consumption of the food throughout the day, they all appeared to have strange symptoms and passed away. A pathologist confirmed that the children died from poisoning of a substance called organic phosphate parathion, which was discovered to be on utensils of the Richardsons' apartment. Richardson was convicted and sentenced to death. Eventually, his sentence was reduced to a life sentence after spending 5 years on death row. The twist in the tale comes when neighbor Bessie Reese, who took care of the children while their parents were at work, confessed to the crimes over 100 times whilst in a care home and suffering from Alzheimer's disease years later. After noting some inconsistencies, Clifton Kelly, a retired circuit court judge, released Richardson in 1989 after suggesting that he hadn't necessarily been given a fair trial. He received $150,000 after settling a lawsuit with DeSoto County, but years later was compensated over $1.2 million, which was pushed through by Florida Governor Rick Scott in 2014, who signed a bill which provides compensation to a wrongfully imprisoned person who was convicted pre-1979. James Joseph Richardson finally put his demons to rest, stating that he had no animosity or anger towards the prosecutors that put him there in the first place.
No, I don't have no animosity. I can say that deeply from my heart. I do not have animosity against no one. But I just was hurt.
Number 6, Raymond Towler. Raymond Towler was charged and convicted of a horrific crime of coaxing 2 children into a wooded area and assaulting them in 1981. DNA testing was the breakthrough that led to the revelation that Towler was wrongfully convicted after Ohio enacted a law allowing testing in specific circumstances. The Innocence Project also helped tip the balance by pushing for Towler's release, and after losing years of freedom, he was eventually exonerated in 2010. In 2011, Towler was awarded $2.5 million in compensation by the state of Ohio. He then followed that up by filing a federal civil rights lawsuit that was settled in 2012 for $4.7 million. Raymond Towler took his experience and turned it into a positive when he spent the years after his release trying to help others.
She seen me speaking of how I held on to my hope. And I don't know how, but I just did. You know, maybe it's from my upbringing, you know, from church, and, you know, knowing how to put things in God's hands, which I kind of had to do because I couldn't get myself out of prison. That's why I stayed in there almost 30 years.
Number 7, Michael Hanline.
The first thing I want to say is to make it absolutely clear that this man, Mike Hanline, spent 36 years in prison for a crime that he did not commit. He is 100% innocent of this crime.
The brutal shooting and murder of a biker, J.T. McDerry in Ventura County, ended up being the catalyst for the wrongful conviction of Michael Hanline. The California Innocence Project uncovered sealed police records of others confessing to the crime. A drug dealer, Bruce Robertson, was the kink in the case as he manipulated a slew of witnesses to testify against Michael, unbeknownst to the defense the prosecutors and Robinson had assembled, ultimately creating a false version of events and, as a result, putting Michael behind bars. In 2010, United States District Court Magistrate Judge Andrew Wistrick recommended that Michael's conviction be overturned, and once DNA testing was introduced to the case, Hanline's conviction was reversed. In November 2014, Michael Hanline was finally released, becoming California's longest-serving wrongfully incarcerated person. After 36 years behind bars for a crime he didn't commit, like many others on this list, all he wanted was the freedom to do the basic things, such as grabbing a cheeseburger and some fries.
Did you enjoy your first bite?
You could do a Carl's Jr. commercial.
He could.
My, oh my. That's what meat tastes like, huh? The commercial does it justice.